Welcome to China in the News. Today, we're discussing the latest on the US China trade talks, the London Agreement on tariffs, and what it all means for the bigger economic picture. The agreement specifies US imports from China will face a total tariff of 55%. China imports from the US will be subject to a flat 10% tariff. China agreed to supply civilian use of rare earth while military-grade magnets remain restricted. Regarding student visa, Chinese students will continue to have access to the U.S. universities. Doug, this feels like a pretty pivotal moment in the ongoing trade tensions, don't you think?
I do, and it's so great to talk to you as always, Christine. And this is such an important time. As you and I have discussed many times, U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China trade relations, this is such a critical time for the U.S. geopolitical economy. And so, I was looking at the world and looking at U.S.-China relations and thinking, wow, we're just in a mess. And then the London talks happen, and okay, things might be on a better path. But let's just dive into a couple of the key things that you just mentioned. Okay. So this doesn't mean tariffs are going away. So there's still going to be, China's still going to face total tariffs of about 55%. And, China imports from the US will be, subject to a flat tariff of 10%. And wow, it seems like, okay, that's an interesting and important negotiation. But the key thing that you mentioned, Christine, is really the heart of the matter. And you and I have talked about this many times, but I just want to emphasize this to the world who's listening to us. China is in a very advantageous position, one, because of its position in the global supply chain management and how important how important China is for companies like Apple and Walmart and Tesla. But probably the bigger issue is how critical China is for rare earths. And, I mean, there are rare earths all over the world, and we've been seeing the negotiations with the Ukraine and discussions about rare earths in that front. But the key issue is that China is the main refinery of about 90 to 93% of rare earths in the world. And so this is, China's got a lot of power here, right? And so, I think you must remember that my favorite story about this when, there was a dust up between Japan and China and the East China Sea in about 2013. And, this is when I was just getting to know Apple and I didn't know a lot about the main issues. But the dust up suddenly went away, and I asked an Apple engineer about it, and this person said, well, basically, China said to Japan, you won't have access to neodymium anymore. And I said to this Apple engineer, what's neodymium? And he kind of looked at me like I was an idiot. And he said, well, neodymium is the most important thing in the world for making these little things called earphones. And so it's a magnet, and China controls 96% of the refinement of neodymium. And so if Sony, a little company in Japan, can't get access to neodymium, we're done. And so I just tell that story because like that was a major learning moment for me, but it also just reflects how important it is that China controls so much of the rare earth production. And so I think this talk in London, yes, it was about tariffs, but I think somebody is on the backside getting through to President Trump and saying like, hey, bud, China has a lot of control over these trade negotiations here, and we need to be careful.
So, speaking of rare earth, we know that China controls nearly half the world's reserve and leading in mining and refining. So their export control could have significant ripple effects. Do you think this is going to push us as a country, United States, to rethink our reliance on Chinese supplies?
Well, and so here again, forgive me if I'm repeating what I was just saying, but there are two key issues here. One is the rare earths issue. And I think that we have to be very cautious about this. China is in a very powerful position. in terms of the production, but most importantly, the refinement of rare earths, right? So it's not that China controls all of the rare earths in the world. There are rare earths coming from many, many different places like Africa and, the sub-Saharan parts of the world. But China has built the manufacturing supply chain that refines about 93% of the rare earths in the world. And so a lot of the production of all of these key things that go into a lot of things in the high tech space come from Chinese refinement. And so that's one key issue. And then the second key issue, which you and I have talked about many times, but I think it's really important, is, the power of China's manufacturing supply chain is very fundamental. And, to the extent that, President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance would like to say, like, well, let's just build iPhones in America and let's just build everything in America. They have they have seemed to have very little understanding of just how complex that manufacturing supply chain is. And it's not just the end-to-end construction of that manufacturing supply chain, but it's also the industrial clusters that come together. And so China both controls the refinement of rare earths, but it also controls the most powerful manufacturing supply chain in the world. And China's just in a powerful position. And so this agreement in London didn't surprise me, Christine, but I'm thankful that it sort of came out and all the high tensions were dialed down.
Well, do you think this move is a temporary de-escalation or a lasting strategy shift?
So my guess, Christine, is it has to be a lasting strategy shift. The idea now, there's bluster in the Trump administration side, and President Trump seems to like to bluster, but it has to be the case that people are starting to get through to him now that, Mr. President, we are not in the powerful position that you think we are. And so my guess is that this is not just a temporary de-escalation, but I think it's going to go for the long term. That's my guess.
Well, when this news first came out, I was really surprised because I know that US tariffs on Chinese goods was went all the way to 145 and now it dropped to 55. But US goods to China is only 10%. So is this a compromise? Why is there discrepancy between 55% and 10%?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And my guess is that this is just a way for the US to kind of maintain face, right? Get right? So because President Trump came out with this crazy notion of 145% and we can build iPhones in America and we can build everything. And no, 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 no. There are some smart economists, some of whom you and I know, that have been in touch with the president and have said, no, President Trump, this is not going to happen this way. But to drop immediately down to zero or down to 10% and have equal would, I think, make President Trump look like he was an idiot and he just didn't understand this dynamic. And so I think they've worked out a negotiation. And by the way, this is good negotiation on the Chinese front because they're like, okay, if you want to have 55% tariffs and that cost is going to be passed on to American consumers, fine. You guys do whatever you want. And then so it allows the Trump administration to save a little face, but I think it also this is a backing down. This is not 145% crazy tariffs that such that we can build everything in America. It's a recognition that we need China and we're partners with China.
So you often said there are no winners in this trade war. Do you still feel that way given the latest agreement in London?
Well, in general, I think there are no winners in trade wars because I think partnership is better than war. And so I just think I'd rather us not be in a trade war. I'd rather us continue to be economic partners. And, you and I have discussed this before, but like our help in getting China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, it's all been good for everybody, right? Like this is not Chinese people stealing our jobs. This is us inviting using manufacturing supply chains in China and cheaper labor such that we could all, have the value of global corporations like Apple be higher, right? I mean, we're all in this together. And so I would rather us all just be partners, but I also understand that President Trump and Vice President JD Vance and the current administration was elected on the ideas that we were going to be tough on trade and we were going to sort of fight hard. And so they need to show some face on this issue. But I think there is clear acknowledgement now that we're partners. Like we just can't, it's just too dangerous for us to go down this road. And so I think that what we're seeing now is something that is significant. And my opinion, Christine, is I think it's going to be lasting.
That would be good news. But when this happened, when the trade war first started, you and I talked about potentially is China's economy able to kind of handle this battle? So let's talk about China's domestic economy for a moment. The real estate sector, which was a huge growth driver in 2000, between 2001 and 2008. Well, 2001 was WTO, and then 2008 is the financial crisis. Well, they seem to be struggling right now. So what's going on in China?
Well, these are great questions, Christine, and let me just handle two pieces of it. We'll first talk about the real estate sector, and then we'll talk about the consumption economy. Okay. So first on the real estate sector, yeah, sometimes when local cities and local governments want to build their local economies, they encourage people, they encourage real estate developers to invest in. And by the way, China is not the first country in the last 20 years to have had a real estate bubble that created a lot of problems. The
Well,
United
who
States
else?
had
Because I know
the
China has a
United
lot of ghost
States
cities.
the United States in 2001 and in 2008, we've had major issues in the real estate bubble as well. So this is like, I always want to caution people a little bit to say, like, guys, we all have made mistakes in terms of overbuilding and in terms of real estate bubbles, right? Including the United States, right? We're not experts in this space,
But
right?
I've seen photos of China's ghost cities.
Of course.
People invest in buying house number two and three in
Of
these
course.
beautiful places that no one ever moved into.
I'm not arguing that this isn't a problem for China. I'm just arguing that real estate bubbles happen in many advanced industrialized economies. China is the second largest economy in the world. The number one largest economy in the world is the United States. And we've had real estate bubbles too, as recently as 15 years ago. Okay.
But
So,
why did China overbuild during this time period?
well, because the, I mean, similar to the reasons that the US overbuilt, but when you have a lot of resources and you want to build a consumption-based economy, you start to invest, right? And so one of the ways that you invest is you invest in building apartment buildings and you hope people will move from their small scale houses in rural China to apartment buildings in the major cities like Shanghai, and they don't always do it, right? I mean, it's just, it's one of the things that's interesting about China is China has relatively high savings rates. And so, like families, in the United States, our savings rates are between 1% and 5% on average for families. In China, they're about 40% for families, right? And so, just because you've built beautiful apartments in major cities like Shanghai or Zhenjiang or Shenyang doesn't mean that people are going to go buy those apartments, right? And so, like, part of the building of a consumption-based economy is tied to local governments building and creating new structures that people are going to want to move to, and people won't always do it because there's cultural issues about how people spend money. And so yes, real estate is a big issue, right? Now, in my opinion, the real estate issue is it's overstated as an issue. Yes, there are ghost towns, and yes, it's going to be a problem for a little while. People will eventually move into these apartments. It will. It will happen, right? We will start to see the 300 million people that live in abject poverty in rural China, and they start to make more money as families, and they start to get more conditioned to the idea of moving into the cities. These apartments will be filled. The bigger issue in China, in my opinion, is the consumption economy, right? And so
Wait,
consumption,
before you move on, can you define consumption economy?
sure. So if you think about growth in economics for any country, you have investment-led growth, and then you have consumption-led growth. Investment-led growth is when cities like Shanghai or cities like New York, you know, lead investment and build housing, right? And you have investment-led growth. It's not only about housing, but it's also about things like, you know, investing in building a manufacturing supply chain in the desert in Arizona. So the city of Phoenix is investment. You have 6.5 billion that came from the US government that came to Phoenix, and you have 165 billion that came from TSMC, and you have the building, right? That's investment-led growth. Okay. Consumption-led growth is the other side of the story, which is when people have money coming in, usually from investment-led growth, and then they're making more and more money as a society, and they start to spend money, right? So they go to McDonald's, or they go to Baskin Robbins, or they buy winter boots for their kids, right? And so consumption-led growth is a very important part of this cycle of you invest in an economy, you build housing, you build a manufacturing supply chain, you create more jobs, and then people start to spend money, right? And so that's investment-led growth on one side and consumption-led growth on the other. The interesting thing about China is that Chinese people culturally have very high savings rates, about 40% on average, which means their families are not spending money. Like they're making money through, the development of the manufacturing supply chain and the development of investment-led growth, but they're saving it in household savings and they're not investing in buying things, right? And so consumption-led growth is very much tied to how much people are spending money. And China has a consumption-led growth problem. And I don't know what the answer for that is, except for the government to say, like, spend money, go out and buy things. But it's just culturally embedded. I mean, you and I both know this because you and I both spent a lot of time in China. People think about saving money for their kids' college
I'm
education,
also Chinese and
right?
I save.
Right.
Well,
So you know what I'm
well,
talking
now
about.
we talk about real estate, we talk about consumption. So there's a high unemployment rates among new grads. And can you talk about kind of the implication for economic stability in China going forward? If you have a new generation of new graduate who's 21, 22 who can't find jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is again a really interesting time in China. I mean, you and I both know the term, but I'll say it for our audience, the Tangping generation, the lying down generation or the lying flat generation. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting about the cultural consequences of different types of policies, right? So in 2008, China ended what was called the one-child policy, right? And so the basic idea was, you know, in China, you could only have one child. And, the idea was like we need to shorten and mollify society and we need for people to really be focused on just smaller families, right? But one of the things that happened, what they didn't realize was that this would become culturally embedded. And so kids would grow up with the understanding that, okay, I'm just a son or a daughter, and I have these not just two parents, but four grandparents, and I'm going to be taken care of, right? And so in 2016, the Chinese government came up with this idea like, we have a problem here because kids aren't feeling emboldened to go out and be amazing, workers in the economy. But they didn't realize that the whole problem with the one-child policy was that it would become culturally embedded. And so you have a whole generation of kids that grew up under this idea of being taken care of by eight grandparents or four parents or two parents and four grandparents and whatever the numbers are. But it was, kids became attached to this, right? And so it's just one of the things that I think you're asking the question of, Christine, is like, well, what is this generation doing? And kids have just grown up in a different cultural environment, right? They've been taken care of in different ways, right?
It's
So,
funny, I saw some video that says, "Hey, I'm a stay-home daughter. I'm a stay-at-home son." And I just thought it was so appropriate with the Tangping
right,
generation.
right.
Well, you know how you said now the one-child policy is embedded. China has a declining population problem. In
It does.
2022, the population fell for the first time in 60 years, dropping by 850,000.
Yeah.
So that is a problem for the manufacturing sector as well as kind of continue to talk to me about kind of the implication of this declining population.
So it's a tremendous problem. When, people in the US wave their hands about this and be like, they're like freaking out about the overbuilding in the real estate sector or the Tongping generation. I think they overstate the issue a little bit because there's still 350 million people from rural China that are part of the migrant labor force, right? And so, like, yes, it is true that it's a big concern that the population is declining, and because of the one-child policy, like, we're not going to continue to have replacement rate. And, you know, for the first time just a couple of years ago, China was surpassed by India as the most populous nation on earth, right? And so, like, this is serious, but the consequences are not going to be felt for about 50 years, right? And so when we hear all of this discussion about the declining population, China still has an immense migrant labor force that is going to continue to be the working class of the industrial sector. But there are issues, right? And so to the point that we were just discussing, now that the one child policy and the one child ideal of what it means to have the perfect family, which is two parents, four grandparents, and one child, that's not replacement rate, right? Replacement rate is about 2.2, right? And, it's going to have consequences, but it probably won't be really felt for China's economy for about 50 years.
Got it. Well, let's get back to the trade war since that's where we get started. So, with all these tensions and attempt at compromises, how should we interpret what's really going on?
Well, it's a great question and it's a great framing of it, Christine. And so the key things that I would just want to be clear about first, one, we have this trade war issue that, I don't know how long Donald Trump has been president now, but it's, 200 days or something like that. But, basically we've been in a position in which this president has been very blustery and saying, trade war, tariffs, we're going to do everything we can and we're going to have iPhones rebuilt in America, and this is all ridiculous. That's not happening, right? China has the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, and it would take the United States 40 years to rebuild manufacturing supply chains that could be key to building things like smartphones. Now, there is an interesting piece here, and our colleague Sarah Kellogg has raised this issue, and I think she's been brilliant about it. There are manufacturing supply chains that exist that wouldn't be refining and building something new. So if we were very strategic and we were to think about manufacturing supply chains in things like the automobile industry, wow, okay, that would be a really interesting play, right? And so what if somebody in the Trump administration was listening to us, Christine? I would advise them to not just have these kind of crazy tariffs and demand that Tim Cook build iPhones in America, because I think that's ridiculous. And it would take very long to rebuild the manufacturing supply chains, just in terms of the linking of the vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain, but also in terms of competitiveness of the industrial clusters that build the components of these things. But it could be done in things like automobiles, right? And so in the automobile industry, we could rebuild this pretty quickly, right? I mean, we have a major steel industry here in America. I grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, which is the steel capital of the world, and a lot of U.S. steel moved to Texas, but it didn't move out of the country. And so all of that infrastructure exists. And then a lot of the infrastructure in a little place that I know pretty well, called Michigan, has a lot of the manufacturing supply chains in terms of components. And we have partners in places like Canada and Mexico, in which these components are shipped across the borders. We could rebuild this. And so, what I think is going to happen, Christine, with this trade war is a lot of the bluster around, like, we need to have iPhones built in America. That's all BS. It's not happening. But if there were key parts of the ways in which the country could think strategically about rebuilding manufacturing supply chains, we have the parts to do it. And so my guess, my hope is that President Trump and his team are going to start to see this, and it will be, we'll start to accept the idea that things like iPhones need to be made in places like China and India, but things like automobiles could be made here. And by the way, a little company called Tesla has a pretty well vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in America already. And so I think that there's major precedent for this. And so that's what I think is going to happen is we're going to see a lot of the things that we're blustering over and focusing on, they're going to be continued to be promoted or produced abroad. But then things that are in major manufacturing sectors, we're going to see them come back. That's what I think is going to happen. That's my prediction.
Got it. Well, the reason why I think the whole trade war started is because there's deep-rooted mistrust and strategic rivalry between our two countries. But like you said, there's a need for us to have deeper diplomatic efforts to address this kind of broader issues, because both countries are economic leaders globally.
We're the two largest economies in the world. And, like if we're going to have an economic Cold War with, what the second largest economy in the world and what used to be our largest trading partner, and now it's not officially our largest trading partner because a lot of the goods come through Mexico, but still, we're married. Like our two economies are married. And you and I have talked about this many times, but like Apple's profitability depends fundamentally on China. Tesla's innovation depends fundamentally on China. Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. We're married. And so, like, the idea that a trade war could come out in any way good for either of our countries is ridiculous. And so, what my hope is that sane people are talking to the president and calming this person down a little bit and just saying, like, hey, we are all in this together. And we can tweak things so that we can rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America and things like automobiles, but we got to be careful. And so that's what I think is happening. And that's what I hope the London talks talk about.
Thank you, Doug. Well, this wraps up today's episode of China in the News. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Stay curious and stay informed. See you next time.
Thank you for the amazing conversation, Christine. Always appreciate talking with you.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.